Good evening and welcome everyone. I hope you're all safe and well. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Luke Hatton. I'm the president of Oxford Climate Society and a third-year engineering undergraduate student at the University of Oxford, aiming to specialise in sustainable energy. Oxford Climate Society is a part of Oxford University, aiming to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaker events, we run educational programmes throughout the year, including our award-winning School of Climate Change, which last term taught over 1,500 people from all across the world in its online school. We also publish the world's largest student climate journal, Anthroposphere, and we are currently working with the university to incorporate net zero policies and climate into the Oxford curriculum. The title of tonight's event is Lessons to be Learned from the COVID crisis to the climate crisis. Over the last year, life as we know it has changed radically due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Activities that we once took for granted, going shopping, meeting up for meals, going into the office for work, have become conditional on the severity of the pandemic. Behavioural shifts such as working from home, that many companies have spent years trying to plan, encourage, and perfect, were completed overnight by necessity. The government's response to the pandemic has also led to a radical shift in the view of the role of government during crises. Policies that would have seemed unthinkable prior to the crisis, such as stimulus checks, pauses on evictions, and financial assistance for struggling businesses, have become commonplace across the globe. It has shown that rapid and radical behavioural change is possible, and that governments can and should respond to crises with policies that push the previous limits of what is politically acceptable. Climate change is one of the biggest threats facing our society, and will require similarly far-reaching behavioural shifts if we are to prevent severe global warming. The coronavirus pandemic provides not only an opportunity to recover in a green way from the economic recession, but an opportunity to learn from our response to advise our much needed shift to low carbon lifestyles and a low carbon society over the next few years. To provide insight onto this topic, we're delighted to be joined by Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh. Professor Lorraine is an environmental psychologist specialising in perceptions and behaviour in relation to climate change, energy and transport. She is based at the University of Bath and is director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. Her research projects have included studies of energy efficiency behaviours, low carbon lifestyles, and responses to climate change. She is a lead author for the IPCC in Working Group 2 and regularly advises the government and other organisations on low carbon behaviour and climate change communication. We're going to start this event with a presentation from Lorraine, which will be followed by some prepared questions by myself, before opening up to you, the audience, at the end. If you have any questions for our speaker, please write them in the live Zoom chat on the right-hand side of YouTube. So thank you very much to Lorraine for joining us this evening, and I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Luke, and really delighted to be here with you this evening. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'll just share a few slides with you. As Luke says, I want to kind of reflect on what we can learn from COVID-19 for mobilising climate action. And as he's mentioned, my role and my research interests are really around public engagement with climate change and behaviour change. So I'll focus particularly on those aspects. I just want to kind of take a minute and reflect on where we've been in the last sort of 12 to 15 months or so. And 2020, of course, started with images like this on the left of the Australian bushfires, these images dominating kind of media coverage and really providing a powerful example of what climate change can mean in terms of its impacts on fragile ecosystems and on communities of people. And of course, it's not only on the other side of the world that climate change was impacting on people and ecosystems last year. The year was actually by far the warmest year on record in Europe and joint second warmest globally on record. And of course, as the year went on, we've in the UK experienced major flooding and other sorts of extreme weather events as well. So these impacts, of course, continue to grow. But as the year went on, we saw more and more images like the one on the right of the pandemic and the impact that has had on on human health and well-being. And of course, our attention has shifted significantly in terms of thinking about the pandemic. But climate change hasn't gone away, of course. Its impacts continue to be felt. But interestingly, also public concern about climate change hasn't gone away. And so we've been polling the public for a number of years, but over the last year and a bit, we've continued to do so. And this bar chart shows that actually in the UK, the percentage saying that addressing climate change requires an extremely high level of urgency or a high level of urgency has actually risen during 2020 compared to 2019, when it was already higher than we'd ever seen it. So despite the fact that, you know, our lives are dominated by COVID-19 and its impacts, people continue to be concerned about something which actually is otherwise often seen as quite distant in many people's lives, as I'll come back to. And we've also found that despite the fact that many people have, you know, been suffering economically and in other ways from the pandemic, there's actually quite strong support for a green recovery from COVID. So, for example, I was part of the Climate Assembly UK, which was the UK-wide Citizens Assembly on Climate Change, and the 108 representative members of the public that learned about climate change and came up with recommendations also concluded that, or the majority of them concluded that steps taken by the government to help the economy recover from COVID should be designed to help achieve net zero. And a lot of other polls show broad support for a green recovery from COVID. And of course, we know that despite the fact that the pandemic has had devastating impacts and broadly, you know, extremely negative problems for the economy, for lifestyles, well-being, etc., we have seen some environmental benefits. So greenhouse gas emissions did fall during 2020 in an unprecedented way. So we haven't seen a drop like this actually ever. So globally, it was about 7 to 8% drop in emissions, and most of that due to COVID travel restrictions, so ground transport accounting for the largest proportion. Now, I guess this raises the question really of whether, in order to tackle climate change, we need to have the sort of restrictions and the sort of level of intervention from government that we've had from COVID in our lives, or whether we can reflect on the sorts of things that we used to do and do things differently after COVID, but in a more planned way to transform our societies to be lower carbon and more sustainable. And I would like to think that we can do the latter, and actually that we can avoid some of the devastating economic impacts that we've had from addressing COVID if we have a planned transition for climate change. Thinking about the two issues, of course, they are different in many ways, but they have some commonalities. They are both global issues. They need individuals to act for the common good. They require government intervention in our lifestyles. They challenge societal resilience, actually. They draw attention to the fact that many of the things that we take for granted as being good or aspirational actually are deeply problematic. And they actually have some common causes and solutions. As I've mentioned, restricting travel helped limit the spread of COVID, but of course, significantly cut greenhouse gas emissions as well. But they are different issues in many important ways as well. Climate change as an issue is generally less tangible and less emotive. So when we think about when we ask people actually what they think about when they reflect on climate change, they tend to focus on quite distant impacts, things like impacts on polar regions and people in other countries. And they tend not to think about the impacts that it would have on themselves or people in their areas. Similarly, climate change is an issue which tends to have lower levels of self-efficacy to reduce the risk. In other words, because it's a global problem, because it's a collective problem, people generally don't feel that if they switch off their lights or maybe stop driving, that it will have a significant effect on reducing the risk of climate change. And they're right, effectively. We all need to be doing all of those things if we're to effectively mitigate climate change, whereas you can mitigate the risk of COVID-19 to a reasonable extent by taking measures individually to reduce contact with others and so on. Climate change also, I would say there's a lower social norm to act. In other words, when we have had these COVID restrictions, you look out the window and you see other people are staying home, generally speaking, and polling shows that most people have complied with COVID restrictions. So there was a very visible norm to comply, and so that encouraged other people to stick to those rules. Whereas with climate change, the social norm is to consume and to drive and to fly and to, aspirationally maybe to have a bigger house, etc. These things are relatively sort of normative things, whereas low carbon lifestyles tend to remain, to a large extent at least, less normative. And so actually, if we look around, we can kind of get the impression, well, nobody else is doing very much to tackle climate change, so probably it's not a very important issue to think about. I mean, it's starting to change, but it's still not to the same extent as COVID. And also we could see that solutions to tackling climate change are probably more ambiguous. So we can't come up with really clear slogans like hand, face, space to convey some of the most important measures to tackle it. Actually, there are so many things we need to do, and the relationship between someone's individual actions and the impact it has on the climate are complex, and they're indirect and so on. So it is difficult to convey the solutions to tackle climate change in a very simple way to people that will help them make decisions. I would also say there's a lower political mandate to intervene for climate change for some of these reasons, actually, because people don't see it as immediate and threatening as COVID. And so you probably wouldn't get the same level of support for these sorts of measures if we were to intervene in this way to tackle climate change. And I think because of there are various reasons why people do the things that they do that make it difficult to support that as well. And also because these sorts of measures to tackle climate change will need to be put in place for the long term, potentially, indefinitely. Whereas we can endure something like a lockdown because we know hopefully it will be a short-term measure. So we will at some point come out of this and hopefully life will become sort of normal again. So, but with climate change, we're talking about radical and permanent transformation of society. So across these sort of different areas, what we need to be able to kind of engage people and to create social change are a range of informational measures to make climate change more tangible, more emotive, to increase people's sense of self-efficacy that they can do something, to change social norms. But we also need policies to create social change that enable people to change their behavior, to reconfigure organizations and change cities, etc., to be lower carbon. And as part of all of this, we also need really strong engagement with the public and participation in creating these solutions, because we need a mandate to have this kind of level of transformation, which we've never really had before. So I want to just take a couple of minutes to kind of give you some concrete examples of how we might do that. So with COVID, what we've seen is that actually we've had messaging that shows why it is important for you personally to take steps to reduce the risk and to protect other people, and how you can do that. So the messaging was very clear, and it also showed the relevance of taking action and why it was important to do that. So we had framing around kind of the benefits to the NHS, but the benefits to you and others too. We need to do something like that for climate change as well. So we need to think about the fact that communication is most effective when it resonates, when it is talking about things that are important to you. We can do that by maybe segmenting audiences, by, for example, understanding that actually the environment and climate change isn't necessarily a central concern for most people. They might express that they think something should be done, but actually usually other things sort of dominate their motivations. And so we can differentiate products by the extent to which they reduce environmental impact or perhaps provide other benefits, like enhancing well-being or being healthy. And we know this from a number of studies that actually if you frame things in terms of people's goals, like saving money, encouraging exercise, having more time, they're more likely to be effective than if you talk about, say, greenhouse gas reductions or climate benefits. And we know climate change has many co-benefits. So the more we can frame them in terms of these more immediate, tangible things that people can benefit from, the better. We need also to change social norms, and we need to build people's sense of self-efficacy, that that taking action makes a difference. We can do that by showing people like you taking action that has tangible benefits, as I've just mentioned. So we can show that actually, people in your neighborhood are installing energy efficiency measures, that actually it's quite easy to do that there are financial benefits perhaps. And we can change the social norms even where there may be a case where not the majority of people are doing something. So you can have what's called a dynamic social norm. So things are changing in a direction that is more and more people are starting to, for example, take low carbon modes of travel to the university. And that's been shown to be very effective in changing behaviour. More generally, we need to change structures, the broader social context, as well as people's kind of decision-making and attitudes around climate change. So this figure comes from the United Nations Environment Programme Emissions Gap Report that was published towards the end of 2020. And it just tries to summarise really all the elements that need to be put in place to change lifestyles and to change society more generally. So we need we need governance, we need regulations, different kind of supply chains, physical infrastructures, but we also need changes in terms of the way in which people interact, social norms, media coverage, and we need changes to people's awareness, knowledge, and so on. And so we need a range of different measures, from economic instruments, laws, to kind of informational measures like labelling and so on. And crucially, we need to get the timing right. So one of the things that we're increasingly finding is that it really matters when you intervene to change behaviour, change organisations, because habits are a really major barrier to lifestyle change. And habits are weaker during what we call moments of change or periods of disruption. Relocation or moving house is one obvious example. And there's been quite a bit of research showing that if you intervene shortly after somebody has moved house, you can effectively encourage them to take more sustainable transport modes, like taking the bus, for example. This figure comes from some German research where they gave people just a one-day free bus pass to try the bus in their area and some information about the bus service. And that was not effective. It didn't increase bus use amongst people that had not recently moved house because they had strong existing travel habits. But it did work very effectively, actually, over doubling the rate of bus use amongst people that had recently moved house. So it was a very low cost intervention, but it was much more effective amongst people that had recently had their habits broken because there was a change of context. Now, of course, one of the biggest moments of change we could possibly imagine, and we hadn't thought about this, of course, when we set out our research programme on moments of change, but it kind of landed on us. So it provided us an opportunity to look at COVID-19 as a moment of change to disrupt lifestyles and think about reconfiguring them in more sustainable ways. So as I mentioned, we've been polling people over the last sort of few months, and we found that obviously people are travelling less for work, but also for shopping and other reasons. They are saving energy and water at home to some extent. One of the most significant changes as well has been in terms of reducing food waste. We've seen people more aware of the food that they're preparing. They're more conscious of what's in their fridge when it's going off. They're using up leftovers, they're batch cooking. They're doing a lot to reduce food waste. which has a positive impact in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. And they're reducing consumption, of course, which is a massive part of their carbon footprint. And they're taking up more creative, greener hobbies of various kinds, which tend to have a lower carbon footprint than some of the things that we were doing before COVID. And what's really interesting is that we asked people if they were planning to continue doing many of these things. And actually, a lot of these things are what people want to continue doing. So people, broadly speaking, want to continue to work from home to at least some extent, if they're able to. They want to continue reducing their food waste, shopping less for kind of as a hobby, as a kind of pastime, and thinking more about kind of resource consumption. So I think a lot of these things, I'm optimistic if we lock in these emergent habits with the right sort of infrastructure, incentives, norms, as I've mentioned, we can actually lock in some of these new habits in the longer term. Just one final thought is that actually the sort of transformation that we need to tackle climate change does need public buy-in. It needs a social mandate for the sorts of transformation that we need. And so we need to engage the public. We need participatory policy making to actually involve people in coming up with effective and fair policies to tackle climate change. We know that fairness, actually more than effectiveness, is a predictor of policy acceptability amongst the public. So actually developing policies that people see as fair is really important for them to be workable and acceptable. And they tend to actually, involving people tends to come up with more effective policies as well. So the sorts of things I'm thinking of here is the growth in deliberative democracy, the sorts of kind of climate assemblies that we're seeing emerging in a number of places, including at the UK level, regional level, and in other countries too. So it's critical, I think, that we continue with this kind of deliberative democratic engagement. So so to sum up then, I think there's quite a lot we can learn from COVID for mobilising climate action. We can learn that radical lifestyle change is possible under certain circumstances, and we don't have all of those preconditions in place at the moment for climate change. But there are things we can do to move in that direction so that we can achieve the level of change that we've seen for COVID for climate. So first of all, we do need to engage people, as I mentioned. We need to build that very strong social mandate for bold policies. But then we need to design interventions that build self-efficacy and motivation, and that they show people the relevance of the issue for them, that they change social norms, and that they remove structural barriers of various kinds. And crucially, that they get the timing right. So as we transition out of lockdown and restrictions start to be lifted for COVID, this might be a brilliant opportunity to actually intervene before new, maybe again, unsustainable habits start to take over again. So we have a window of opportunity right now to lock in some of the good things that we've been doing over the last year or so. And I'll leave it there.
That's really great, Lorraine. Thanks so much for that presentation. It was really interesting, and I'm sure our viewers found it very educational. So we'll move on now to the prepared questions. I guess my first question is, what can we do to make sure that some of the shifts to low carbon behavior, the fact that they're going to be more difficult because they will have to be permanent compared to sort of the shifts over the last year, what can we do to make sure to make those shifts easier for people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's critical that we think about what we can do to make things easier for people, easier, cheaper, more attractive, more normal, as well as this issue of being timely. And so I think the sorts of things are about, reducing or removing cost barriers. So we need to think about kind of how economic measures can make the lower carbon option cheaper than the higher carbon alternative. We need to be thinking about kind of removing some of the most polluting products from the market. So actually sort of regulating to remove some of the things that we currently can buy. we need to crucially be thinking about what changes can happen at the city level around kind of infrastructure. So, for example, travel infrastructure. We're starting to see some of these measures be put in place due to emergency COVID-19 funding to support active travel, walking and cycling in cities. That's primarily to encourage people, to give people space to walk around cities, but actually it means that there's less space on the roads for cars, more for pedestrians and cyclists. So it shifts the incentives away from driving towards more sustainable modes, and means that actually it helps break people's habits and create lower carbon habits instead. So those are the sorts of things that then we need to kind of keep in place, ideally for the longer term, so that it does make it kind of easier for people to do the right thing.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And so I'm also wondering, do you anticipate, so for some behaviors that we haven't been able to do over the past year, the more high emitting, do you anticipate people sort of almost going mad when they can go back to this, sort of like, say, going on holiday? Has it led to sort of a pent up demand for those things? And I guess, how do we deal with that when thinking about sort of the transition to a low carbon lifestyle?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I focused on, I think, some of the more promising trends, but I think actually, while it might be sort of, I think we are going to see workplaces and organizations and businesses encouraging people to and helping people work from home. And some of the kind of city level changes I mentioned, I think those are positive signs. But I think you're right, we are going to see a bit of a rebound in terms of consumption of goods and travel. And I think what the evidence seems to show is that while people are not particularly keen to necessarily travel as much as they did for work, they are keen to travel for leisure and on holiday and get back to taking trips potentially abroad, but also I think more and more in the UK. So we need to kind of think about how we can deal with that. We've definitely seen in our polling that there's less of an appetite, I think, to take international trips over the last year. And while, I think we are going to see some rebound, I think hopefully we're not going to see the level of international travel demand that we have seen in the past. But as you say, what we really need to do is to have the policy measures in place to shift the incentives away from things like taking international travel, enabling people to take domestic trips by low carbon modes. So I think the government's planned removal of fuel duty on domestic flights is not a great example. What we need to have is the policy measures that are actually encouraging people to take lower carbon modes of travel instead of flying, and not expanding airports, for example, so not facilitating international aviation. And in terms of consumption, we need to be thinking about all of the things that we can do to move towards a more kind of circular and sharing economy. So I think while we are going to see some sort of rebound in consumption, I think the more we can encourage and enable companies to do things like provide opportunities to share products, there's already a bit of a rise in terms of platforms that enable people to share and give things away secondhand, etc., or sell things. That's the sort of things that we need to be encouraging, is that kind of sharing economy, and making things in a way that has a lower carbon footprint itself as well. So there's lots of things that we just need to be putting in place, and governments in particular, but also businesses, to shift people away from these kind of high consuming tendencies.
That's great, thanks. I guess, so you touched on government. So do you think that the pandemic has led to sort of a change in the way that the public, and I guess the government as well, perceive sort of science and experts? I guess over the last few years, I guess especially with Brexit, we've seen sort of almost a rejection of the traditional sort of norms of taking expert advice. And do you anticipate that making it more difficult to get these sort of policies through?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. There was a backlash against experts a few years ago, which and climate experts were amongst those that were sort of seen as maybe having some sort of ulterior motive, some sort of agenda that made them particularly untrustworthy. I think we might be beginning to see, as you say, a bit of a shift back in favour of experts in light of the role that they played in COVID. So I think that is one of the things that I'm sort of hopeful that we might be kind of moving back towards, a bit more trust in experts. But that said, I think there's so much complexity in climate change. Even more, COVID already, there's so many uncertainties about, what sort of measures work, how things, how it's transmitted, etc. I think we do need to sort of think about the role of expertise in relation to climate change, with that in mind, with the fact that actually experts don't always have the right answers. There is a process of societal decision making that needs to happen in light of how much, what experts can tell us. So things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries are a really important part of that, along with conventional kind of, democracy. So listening to what the public want, as well as what experts kind of say, the evidence is. So I think that is kind of putting expertise in its place in relation to kind of societal values and public engagement.
Yeah, what you were saying about it sort of go back to sort of having that participatory democracy, as well as sort of taking on board the experts' advice.
Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, so I guess talking about sort of communication, what takeaways are there for activists in trying to explain and convince people about climate change? Especially, I guess, we've seen over the last year, there's been a small portion, but some portion of the population that have been sort of subject to disinformation or conspiracy theories about, say, COVID-19 or vaccines.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we sort of already know that social media is can be kind of quite an echo chamber. So you can really just choose your information sources, and it can reinforce your pre-existing views in a way that it is also possible through other kind of conventional media, etc. But it isn't really all the more the case sort of on through social media. And it does make it, there is a risk of disinformation and there as well, particularly. I think our studies also show that even with kind of more conventional media, it's impossible to change climate skeptics' views about climate change, actually. So we did experiments where we gave people different messages about climate change. Some saying it was a hoax, some saying it was really the worst thing we could experience, etc. And people that were already predisposed to think it wasn't a serious problem became even less convinced that it was, that it was a problem, having read this various information. And people that were already very concerned became even more concerned, reading the same information. So people tend to kind of reinforce their existing views, actually, when it comes to these sorts of, I guess, contentious issues or issues where there are different views, at least. And so that means it's all the more important to create messaging that is framed around what the audience values, what's important to them, their pre-existing knowledge, etc. So tailoring information to resonate with the audience. So learning what we can from COVID, we know that actually speaking in ways that is really clear, giving clear direction, but also in terms that will show why it matters. So this will reduce the risk to you. This will mean that you can access the NHS if you need to, etc. So there are really clear messages about the benefits of taking action, why you need to take action. So we need to transpose that for climate change and say, well, this is what it means if we don't act on climate change, and what it will mean for you and your country, your people like you, people that you care about, and things that you care about. And so there are some really interesting examples of campaigns that reframe climate change in ways that are much more personally meaningful to people, and sort of talking about the risk of, well, for example, chocolate supply is drying up because there is just pestilence or in that part of the world, or whatever the climate change impacts are that mean that you can't get that important thing. But equally, even if you don't believe in climate change, you can still talk about policies to tackle climate change in a way that can be framed around those co-benefits I mentioned in my talk. So, it can reduce your bills if you insulate your home. it is healthier if you walk and cycle versus drive. So there are some undeniable co-benefits of taking these actions, even if you don't care about climate change. And I think we need to focus messaging around some of those.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess, yeah, speaking to everyone's values kind of avoids that sort of polarization, which we've definitely seen over the last sort of few years on many issues. So I'm going to move now to sort of the audience questions. So as a first, we have, how could we avoid environmental racism and injustice during the shift?
Oh, I'm a bit out of my comfort zone here, but I mean, I think it's definitely the case that some people kind of argue that sort of climate anxiety and concern can be kind of seen as like quite a sort of a white middle class kind of issue, and we need to kind of be thinking about actually the fact that the people that are most at risk of impacts from climate change are people in developing countries. They are the most deprived people, they are women, they are people of color, etc. We need to be thinking about actually addressing climate change is an issue of addressing social inequality, and that framing is critical for bringing in people that might be interested in those issues actually. And I think it's also recognizing that people in different countries and different walks of life also have many of the solutions that we need to tackle climate change. So reflecting on the fact that maybe in the UK we've had a terrible history here in terms of pollution, and we are one of the biggest polluters, and the richest people in our society are the worst. So we need to kind of think about actually how can we learn from countries where they're maybe taking a different development route in terms of what we're doing and supporting their development and so on. But yeah, this is a little bit on the edge of my expertise.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. So the next question is, what are your thoughts on behavioural nudge interventions that tend to implicitly target individuals' behaviour without addressing their underlying values, morals, worldviews, or societal norms?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think nudge can do a lot. I mean, I think, the evidence is quite clear that using things like defaults, for example, there was a really good example, I can't, was it Switzerland or Austria? They made renewable energy as being like the default in either the one region or maybe even the whole country. And so they went from kind of like 5% of the country having a renewable energy tariff to 85 or 90% of the country, just by saying this is the default. So you don't take away people's choice. You can opt out and have a fossil fuel energy source, but you just make it easier for people to just agree with whatever is the default. An enormous impact. So there are cases where nudges are brilliant, okay, and they really work. But there are plenty of cases where they're just not really appropriate. So you can't really nudge people onto a public transport service that doesn't exist in your area. And I agree that actually, when we're thinking about the sort of societal transformation that we need to tackle climate change, it is about thinking about people's values, worldviews, and factoring those into policy making. So there is a question about what sort of society do we want, and engaging people in that debate, because without bringing people with us, we have disenfranchisement, we have protests, we have the public completely opposed to some of the very profound measures that we're going to need to tackle climate change. So we need to bring people with us, and this is outside of the whole realm of nudge. We need to have that engagement as a prerequisite to the sorts of changes that we need to implement. But then we can use nudge as one of the tools to bring about that change.
Yeah, I guess from hearing, there's a very sort of, is a complementary tool. It's not going to subsume
exactly
people's values, morals, and views. That's crazy about Norway or Sweden.
Austria, I think. Anyway, I'll try and put it in the chat if I can.
Yeah, definitely. I know for many people, like, it's often easier to just go with the default, and then having that choice to do something which is not great can sort of.
Yeah, making it easy for people is really a key. I mean, so the nudge unit in the government, the behavioural insights team, are doing some pretty good stuff. They are really significantly changing behaviour. They talk about EAST. I think it's easy, attractive, social, timely. Just think about kind of 4 things and how to change behavior. So it's a nice, like, it does really oversimplify things, but they are really, really important things to think about.
So moving on to the next question, we have, do we know the why of people becoming more entrenched in beliefs already have? I guess this goes back to sort of that polarization.
Do we know why people?
Yeah, do we know how and why people become more entrenched in the beliefs that they already held?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so, I mean, I think this is kind of, there is this sort of fundamental psychological principle of confirmation bias that we gravitate towards information which supports what we already believe. And I think part of that is about just simplifying information processing. We are surrounded by enormous quantities of information. So if we have a pre-existing kind of framework and set of even tentative beliefs, then sort of gravitating towards information which just sort of reinforces that, as opposed to having to renegotiate your beliefs, I think is sort of psychologically simpler. And in some cases, people get kind of attached to their beliefs. And it's almost part of their identity. So this happens with some of these issues, which, are bound up with ideology, politics, your worldview, that then it becomes really difficult to move away from believing something that is part of that sort of fundamental value set almost. And so climate change, I mean, to some extent in this country, we have this a bit. There is some political polarization. Those on the furthest right tend to be the most skeptical than people on the left. In the US, we see that much more strongly. That if you are a Republican, you're probably more likely to not be very concerned about climate change. And that's part of almost being a Republican means that you're not, you don't really believe in climate change, or you don't really support too much climate action. So it becomes part of like a kind of core set of beliefs that then you'd have to maybe give up being a Republican to denounce that. So the more it's sort of part of that that ideological component, then it becomes particularly difficult.
Yeah, I guess that illustrates exactly why it's so important to speak to people's values and beliefs, because if they already have an entrenched opinion that's part of their values and beliefs, you're not going to be able to change it.
Exactly. And so we've actually done work trying to reframe things to appeal to different people with different politics. So people on the right of centre politically, for example. And so, that group has so conservative voters, for example, we looked at, and they have values around kind of stability and valuing tradition and security, jobs, economic growth. There were sort of a constellation of core values. And we sort of managed to kind of map sort of climate change arguments onto those core values. And when we did that, it was pretty effective actually in getting them to sort of sign up to some of the sort of measures like, energy efficiency or investing in renewables or all of these sorts of things. You can frame it around sort of energy security or green jobs or protecting ancient landscapes, or so there are ways in which you can talk about the benefits of taking climate change action that really resonate. And so you can, I think that reframing is critical.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So the next question is a bit longer. The government's plan to net zero doesn't rely heavily on reduced consumption and behavioural change, and it puts more emphasis on electrification, for example. So should we stop framing climate action as a set of restrictions to align public discourse with the net zero plan? And would we receive more support in that way?
These are great questions, aren't they? You're quite right to point out that the government plan doesn't talk very much about changing consumption, reducing consumption. It talks about kind of getting people to buy sort of greener things like electric vehicles and heat pumps and so on. But we know from Committee on Climate Change analysis and many other reports and so on that we will need to reduce the amount of consumption. And so it's not going to be enough to get us to buy greener things. And the techno-fix kind of solution is just not enough. We need to actually change lifestyles. We need to change organizations, business models. So I mentioned about kind of the sharing economy, circular economy. So we need And there are economic opportunities there too. So it's not the case that we are necessarily talking about kind of massive job losses. Actually, it's just reconfiguring the economy and creating jobs in greener sectors, and thinking about, what we can do to support sharing platforms, for example, and repairing businesses and those sorts of things, as opposed to supporting businesses that just produce kind of disposable goods. So, and that doesn't mean that we have to, take a hit in terms of our quality of life at all. In fact, actually, most of the evidence suggests that a lot of the measures that we need to get to net zero will improve people's well-being. But it's just thinking about well-being in a different way, as opposed to the more we earn, the happier we are, which we know is not the case, actually. It's that we certainly need a certain level of income to meet our basic needs. But then beyond that, actually, well-being kind of tends to plateau. And so we need to think about, well, how can we have jobs that are more rewarding and fulfilling? How can we enable people to spend more time with their family and kind of interact with members of their community? And their hobbies be kind of more creative and fulfilling in other ways. So it's about thinking about the fact that those things will make us happier, as well as being lower carbon things as well. So I don't think it's the case that we need to sell the government's plan, or that the government's plan is an easily sellable one to the public. I mean, that may be the case, but I think actually we also need to kind of talk to the public about the fact that there are these wider co-benefits of changing societies in a more sustainable direction, and get them involved in deciding exactly what we're aiming for in terms of a low carbon society.
That's great, thank you. So the next question is, do you have any thoughts on how to engage with multi-ethnic groups in conversations around climate change and ecology?
Again, this is an area which I haven't really done much work in, but we did. So with DEFRA, we did do a little bit of analysis of some of our survey data recently, looking at how different ethnic groups conceive of the environment and climate change. And we definitely found some pretty significant differences, and that people had been adapting their behaviour in different ways in light of COVID as well. Which provided then different sort of opportunities to kind of lock in low carbon habits. So I think, but I suppose more generally, it does come down to kind of understanding what different communities value, where they're coming from in terms of their needs and what they want to achieve, etc. And then framing information in a way that resonates with that. So while I've not really done much in terms of like tailoring messaging to different ethnic groups, we have done work with, as I mentioned, kind of different political groups with different beliefs. And so the principles are kind of the same, I think, but it is also recognizing that there might be certain groups that are particularly impacted by climate change, and then being sensitive to talking about actually the very real benefits to mitigating climate change for some of those minority groups, which maybe not all of us necessarily would be kind of at risk from. So that would kind of be an element that comes in as well. So, but yeah, I'm afraid it's not an area I've personally done really much work in.
Yeah, no worries. That's a great response. Yeah, I guess it is all coming back to these ideas of speaking to people's values and beliefs and identities. And of course, it's not just their politics that is part of their identity. For many people, it's their culture, their religion, their ethnicity, and it's sort of thinking all about all of those influences on how they see climate change and climate action.
Yeah, and I think as well, it is also recognizing issues around trust, because you mentioned kind of expertise earlier, and I think it is really interesting looking at how different ethnic groups have engaged with kind of the vaccination program, and kind of understanding why there might be kind of huge amounts of hesitancy amongst some groups because of the way in which they've been, the engagement they've had in the past with kind of medical institutions. And so when we engage around climate change, we might need to kind of reflect on how might their understanding of expertise be different to, other people's understandings.
That's great, thanks. So how can we get governments to include climate awareness in their curriculums so that the younger generations have the knowledge and tools to combat the climate crisis? And how, as educators, can we support young people and teachers who want to engage with the climate crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is absolutely critical. I touched on kind of habits in my talk, and I think the earlier we can kind of intervene in people's kind of understanding about the world and their habits and creation, then the better, because of the later in life that we engage with people, the more we're dealing with kind of entrenched habits that are difficult to change. So engaging young people is critical for that reason, but also because they are the ones that are likely to experience the worst climate impacts, because that will be in the future. And this is a group as well who don't even really have a strong say in decision making about how we tackle climate change. So it is really important to kind of empower that group as far as we can as well, but be sensitive to the fact that these are messages which might potentially be quite threatening. So we need to sort of balance the information we give about climate change and the risks associated with it with a sense of what people can realistically do, what young people can realistically do. And build that sense of self-efficacy to enable them to kind of feel they can do something at least about it. And that might be taking action in their personal lives, like cutting their own carbon footprint, but it might also be about kind of engaging with decision makers and talking to teachers and parents and lobbying community leaders or going to the city council or whatever to try and call for action more generally. So I think there's important things that we can do through education, which is not just about giving young people facts, but also, sort of empowering them in different ways. And there's a growing set of resources available to educators to enable them to do that. I'm part of a network that's a climate change education research network, which is trying to grow some of these resources. So there is starting to be kind of stuff available to educators. So I think, and I mentioned as well the Climate Assembly UK, the big UK Climate Citizens Assembly on Climate Change. Education was such a strong recommendation that came out of that I think I hope the UK government is sort of listening to that as one of the key recommendations and starts to do more to kind of put climate change within the curriculum, not just within science, but in other subjects in schools.
Yeah, I know, for example, from talking to my younger brother, that there is definitely both the demand for it in young people compared to sort of when I was at school. I think there's a bigger demand for climate education, which I think definitely will help in its favor.
Yeah, exactly. And also I think it's important to think about what skills we can teach young people, not just like how to live in a climate change, in a world that is changed by climate change, but also to get jobs in new sectors that are going to be growing, the sharing economy, plant-based diet, type jobs, all sorts of jobs that are likely to be opening up and growing in years to come. We need to be skilling young people to have the skills for those new jobs.
That's great, thank you. Just as a final question from the audience, do you think government should promote work from home as a norm even in post-COVID era? And although working from home can reduce emissions, is there a counter effect from increased domestic energy use?
Yes, that's another great question. So I think there's a few things to think about. I think it's interesting that UK government has so far said that they don't really want people to work more from home, and yet lots of massive employers are encouraging that anyway. And in Wales, the First Minister actually said that he wants Wales to move towards more home working in the future. So there's a difference between the Welsh and the UK policy messages. But the benefits, there are sort of work-life balance benefits potentially that can be accrued if you do work more from home. But the evidence suggests employers need to put in place measures to ensure that employees are supported in the home, that there is that well-being, they have contact with colleagues, etc. So I think in a lot of cases, employees and employers prefer some sort of hybrid solution where they may be in the office 2 or 3 days a week, and so it still reduces emissions from commuting and probably a lot of business travel during the day as well. But it's a balance. It enables them also to have kind of face-to-face contact with colleagues, etc. So I think that's where things are starting to move towards, and that seems to kind of capture the best of both worlds in a way. there was a related question. What was then there was something about
yeah, it's about although working from home can reduce emissions,
oh
is the
yes,
counter effect from
energy use. That I have to say I don't know a lot about this, the extent to which energy use at home balances out energy use in the office. And I think it does also come down to the fact that whether offices are closing as a result of people coming into the office less, or if there's the same office space being heated and lit, etc., to enable people to kind of come in flexibly, but then also potentially be at home some days. So I think you do get those benefits overall if some offices are closing and there's a reduction in office space. So, but yeah, I don't know too much about the exact emission calculations, I'm afraid.
I guess, yeah, it's quite a difficult quantification to make. Even thinking about sort of like the emissions you have traveling to work, traveling back. I imagine probably hybrid would potentially have slightly more emissions, but whether that's offsetted by something else.
Yeah, but I think the incentives for people who are working at home to save energy are clear because you would save money generally. Whereas in the office, we know people don't usually bother to save energy because they're not paying the bills. So at least, even if, in theory, there's, the same potential for people to use energy, the same energy needs in a way, at least people at home might be a bit more kind of sensitive to, well, actually, I will switch off these lights or turn down the thermostat a little bit or something. So,
yeah. That's great. Yeah, so I think we'll close up there. I just want to say really great thanks to you for providing an interesting intro and insight into the lessons that can be learned from COVID to the climate crisis. To all our audience, I really hope that you've enjoyed tonight's event, and please make sure to follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter to keep up to date with our next events. And with that, I'll bring our event to a close. I hope you have all enjoyed and have a nice rest of the evening.